lishonile bafana masibu izinkomo zobaba. Ilanga lishonile bafana masibu izinkomo zobaba. Ilanga selishonile bafana masibu izinkomo zobaba. Ilanga lishonile bafana masibu izinkomo zobaba. Sengibathengi bheka ngasematekeni angiboni lutho. Sengibathengi bheka ngasematekeni angiboni lutho. Sengibathengi bheka ngasematekeni angiboni lutho. Wasiyona bola ngani na masiyeki inkomo zobaba semuka nomoya. Wasiyona bola ngani na masiyeki inkomo zobaba semuka nomoya. Wasiyona bola ngani na masiyeki inkomo zobaba semuka nomoya. Wasiyona bola ngani na masiyeki inkomo zobaba semuka nomoya. Bafana zipina izinkomo zobaba. Bafana zipina izinkomo zobaba. Bafana zipina izinkomo zobaba. Bafana zipina izinkomo zobaba. Webafana thathani izinduku, webafana thathani izinduku, webafana thathani izinduku, siyobheka izinkomo zobaba esigangeni. Webafana thathani izinduku, webafana thathani izinduku, webafana thathani izinduku, siyobheka izinkomo zobaba esigangeni. Wasiyona bola ngani na masiyeki inkomo zobaba semuka nomoya. Wasiyona bola ngani na masiyeki inkomo zobaba semuka nomoya. Wasiyona bola ngani na masiyeki inkomo zobaba semuka nomoya. Wasiyona bola ngani na masiyeki inkomo zobaba semuka nomoya. Ilanga lishonile bafana masibu izinkomo zobaba. 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 Webafana thathani izinduku, webafana thathani izinduku, webafana thathani izinduku, siyobheka izinkomo zobaba esigangeni. Webafana thathani izinduku, webafana thathani izinduku, webafana thathani izinduku, siyobheka izinkomo zobaba esigangeni.
Warmest greetings, sisters and brothers, and welcome to the Pan-African People's Phone-In. The Pan-African People's Phone-In is an on-air workshop discussing issues and themes related to Pan-Africanism. The particular mode of operation at this point in time is to actually go through a number of books systematically. The first of those books is Pan-Africanism from Program to Philosophy. Now, occasionally, we may have guests. That's not so for the time being, but occasionally we may have guests, and you'll be invited to ring in and pose questions to guests. Have discussions, if you like, with guests on air. But for the time being, we'll be working, very much by the schedule of the book, and the line is open for that. You can ring in and pose questions or make comments in relation to the book. In fact, you're encouraged to actually do that. We ask you to spread the word. Please tell all of your family, friends, fellow organization members, associates, colleagues, and other people you know about the show. Spread it across your networks. Let them know that this program is happening every Monday from 8 p.m. until 10 p.m. I want to say a big thank you to all of those people that listen to the program, and all of those people that aspire to listen to the program also. But in addition to that, I want to say a big thank you to those people that have been spreading the message. I know that some people have actually, taken the time and energy to share the message with others. And I want to say a big thank you to you for doing so, and encourage you to just keep that standard up. I'm sure that will bring more people into the circle. I want to say a big thank you to the station's engineers, who are hard at work even as we speak. A warm greetings to you, the station engineers. A warm greetings also goes out to the station's management here on Bless Radio. The work that they do in the background is invaluable, and so we say a good evening to you. And also, of course, I want to say a good evening to my fellow presenters here on Bless Radio. It's a delight to be part of this team of presenters, and so we certainly look forward to additional works that we will be doing as time moves forward. Let me give out the number. The number for interaction is 079 444 313 66. Now, as usual, I'm just going to suggest, I'll read it out again in a while, but as usual, I'm going to suggest that you use this as an opportunity to look for a piece of paper or to get whatever implement or tool you use to document and record the number for the program, because you never know, you may feel that you want to ring in and make a comment. I'm happy just to go through the information, but if people want to interact on the information, that option is there also. And I tend not to read out the number during the program, so let me give it to you now in the hope that if you're looking for an implement to document the number, that you've got it. So the number for interaction in this week's program, and every week's program actually, is 079 444 313 66. So that's the number as I said, for interaction in the program. And what we will do now is we will move into the libation corner. So this is the libation corner. This is the section of the program where we honor our ancestors and the historical liberation achievements of our ancestors. Now you can contribute to the libation corner in one of three ways. Firstly, if you have a loved one that has recently passed, you are invited to ring in and have that loved one acknowledged here in the libation corner. Secondly, if it is the anniversary of the passing of a loved one, then again you are most welcome to ring in and have your loved one acknowledged right here in the libation corner. And thirdly, if there is an African historical anniversary that all of us should be remembering at this time, then again you're actively invited to ring in and have that African historical anniversary acknowledged right here in the libation corner. Now what I do is I share some libations, and those are generally, and it will be today also, African historical anniversaries. And if you decide that you want to ring in to share one of your libations, all that will happen is that I will stop, allow you to make your contribution, and then after you've made your contribution, I will resume the libations that I'm sharing. So there'll just be 3 libations from me today. Today is the 2nd of March. It's a new month. The 2nd of March 2020. And moving to the 3rd of March, and we go back to the year 1886. On the 3rd of March 1886, one of our ancestors by the name of R.F. Fleming patented a guitar. You see, our connection with music is strong. African people produced music at home in Africa, and even when we came out to the diaspora under the most horrendous circumstances, we continued to produce the best quality music. And it stands to reason that if you produce the best quality music, that you will also be the inventor of instruments. And we're reminded of that by our ancestor R.F. Fleming, who patented a guitar on the 3rd of the 3rd, 1886. And moving on to the 4th, that's the 4th of March, and this time it's the year 1875. Because on the 4th of March 1875, one of our ancestors by the name of Garrett A. Morgan, yes, we know Garrett Morgan, he was born in the state of Kentucky. I believe the state of Kentucky is in the southern part, intensely racist part. I mean, the whole of US Satan is racist now. But this is where the lynch mobs were in very, very serious operations in the deep south. And I believe that Kentucky is part of that so-called deep south. So remember, Garrett Morgan, inventor of many things, including, as I understand it, the traffic lights. We remember that great ancestor at this time. Happy birthday to you, Garrett Morgan. And the third and final contribution that I'm going to make to the Libation Corner in this week's program is going to be to remember one of our ancestors by the name of R. Watts. And he patented on this day a bracket for a miner's lamp. You know, so they had us doing all kinds of work, including mining. And of course, when you're underground, in pitch black, you can't see. So one of our ancestors went beyond just a torch, which you'd hold in your hand, and put the torch on his head, on his forehead, so that it would shine light in whichever direction he was looking. So these inventions are the inventions of African people, if only we knew it. So we remember this ancestor, R. Watts, who patented the bracket for the miner's lamp on the 7th of March, going right the way back into the century before last.
Lord knows I do. You look at my eyes and see that a great big man like me has been crying. Oh Lord, sitting in my lonely room, filled with nothing but gloom and I've been a dying baby. Oh Lord, because ever since the day you left, I don't know what to do with myself. All on my hands and knees wishing for your return. And oh, how I yearn. And I miss you, I miss you, baby. Lord knows I do. I miss you, baby. I really miss you. I said I miss you, baby. Lord, I said I miss you, 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 baby. I just can't do without you.
So that brings the Libation Corner to a close for this week. Shortly we will go into the readings around Malcolm X and the strategy of Malcolm X. Let me just remind everybody that we are working from the book Pan-Africanism, From Program to Philosophy. I know there's a camera in the studio, so just to help, I'll hold the book in the direction I'll hold the book in the direction of the camera in case people are interested. It certainly helps if you've read the book to be able to digest better and interact on the subject matter of the book. So it's Pan-Africanism from Program to Philosophy, subtitled An Outlook on Liberation. And just to give an overview of the book, the back of the book gives the overview, and it says, Pan-Africanism from Program to Philosophy is the only book in the world to provide clear, lucid, and simple explanations of the liberation strategies of Malcolm X, Kwame Nkrumah, and Marcus Garvey. Historians have been naturally concerned with reporting facts of the lives of these great Pan-Africanists, but it is for activists to contextualize them in liberation strategies and action plans, a process kick-started in this book. In addition, 1. It provides a clear, succinct explanation of international capitalism's parasitical dependence upon African people. 2. It provides a clear, simple explanation of scientific socialism, relating it to African principles and culture. 3. It introduces the notion of the greater cycle of revolution, which examines and locates revolution not as an incident, but as a process in the context of the entirety of human history. 4. Through an examination of universal principles, it locates the material base of two opposing sets of ideologies driving human activity, and identifies the natural position of African culture in that milieu. And finally, 5. Through a newly devised set of dialectical tools, it provides a powerfully clear philosophical analysis of matter as a basis for uncovering and understanding the universal laws required for Africa's liberation. Pan-Africanism from Program to Philosophy is a long overdue, much needed source book on the theory of Pan-Africanism. For people new to Pan-Africanist activism, or those who simply want to understand what Pan-Africanism is, this book provides clear theoretical guidance. For seasoned cadres and veterans of the Pan-Africanist movement, it is a checkpoint, frame of reference for assessing, orientating, or even refocusing the trajectory of their activities. Ideally, it should be studied collectively in groups, particularly those genuinely working towards the liberation of Africa and her people in the context of worldwide revolution. So that's the overview on the book, and what we have been doing is we have been looking at the strategy of Malcolm X for the past couple of weeks, actually. So this is the third week for the strategy. Well, certainly this is the final week for the strategy of Malcolm X. I suspect that we will cover the chapter in what remains of today. Now, we looked at the beginning of the strategy of Malcolm X last week. In fact, we did a little bit of contextualizing before we went into the strategy, and we looked at, some of the important characteristics of Malcolm X. One of which being that he couldn't be held down. Malcolm X, as I pointed out last week, had a criminal background. He was a drug dealer, a pusher. He was a pimp. He was a criminal. He did bad things. He ended up in prison. And after ending up in prison, he was revived, really, by the Nation of Islam. So there were other prisoners inside, some of whom were members of the Nation of Islam, and he was guided to a better path. And he came out to become the spokesperson of the Nation of Islam. So brilliant was Malcolm X. But one of the underpinning morals of the story of Malcolm X is that if he could be so bad at one point in his life, the point at which he was called Detroit Red, and then be transformed into someone so good for humanity, then it means that, any of our children out there who are doing badness, who are dabbling in drugs, even the ones who are pulling out knives and stabbing, their brothers and sisters in the street. It means that there is hope. It means that the possibility of their redemption is real. It means that they can improve their lives to the point of making outstanding contributions to the advancement of humanity. And so Malcolm X sets the example that the capitalist state hates the most. Someone who was, in political terms, left for dead, rises like a phoenix from the ashes to become a champion, a leader, a great leader. And so if Malcolm X can do it, there's no reason why any and all of us can't do the same if we've fallen into that unfortunate path. And last week when we looked at the strategy of Malcolm X, we unveiled Malcolm X's strategic method just to start us off. And we started with the aim in sight. And we just confirmed that there were, 4 basic pillars or 4 basic premises that underpinned the strategy of Malcolm X. The first being that African people must win Africa to be liberated. The second, that African liberation will occur only after African people have collectively taken full control of Africa's land. So all the stuff that we're doing at the moment, which is important, and we must continue to do things to try and liberate ourselves, it will never amount to liberation until we have taken proper control of our motherland. So this was a message from Malcolm X. The third pillar is that a liberated Africa will provide protection for her children in the diaspora. This is particularly relevant to us. We live in England, many of us who are listening now. Some of us may live in other parts of the diaspora. Our safety depends on the strength of our motherland. If Africa is strong, people will not mess with us. If Africa is weak, all kinds of advantages will be taken of us, including killing us in police custody, including throwing our children out of schools, giving them the worst type of education, so that they fail in the schooling system, including lower life expectancy. Why should Africans have lower life expectancy than Europeans? It makes no real sense. But if you look at the statistics, you'll find that. So all of these disadvantages are heaped in our favour, in our direction. And part of the reason that they're heaped in our direction, unemployment is another example, that we suffer greater unemployment than other groups. And one of the reasons why these kinds of things are heaped in our direction is because our motherland is not strong and cannot protect us. The Chinese motherland is strong. It protects them. You don't hear of Chinese being killed in police custody. You don't hear of Chinese being excluded from school. I don't know if anybody knows a Chinaman that's on the unemployment queue. Maybe there is one somewhere, but you don't see too many of them. And so on. And this is because China is strong. So China, even indirectly, provides protection for its children. And so the third pillar of Malcolm X's strategy is to remind us that that when Africa is strong, it will provide protection for us here. So we have a vested interest in making Africa strong. And the fourth pillar, that the African motherland cannot be truly free until her children in the diaspora are free. In other words, there's no freedom for anybody in the motherland until those of us in the diaspora are free. So we rely on Africa for our ultimate freedom, and Africa relies on us as her children for her ultimate freedom also. There's a reciprocal relationship between African people at home in the motherland and African people in the diaspora, as many of us are who are listening now. So what I'm going to do from this point then is move forward looking at the strategy of Malcolm. In fact, what I'll do is I will play one rhythm before going into the strategy.
We're sitting here live with author, lecturer, historian Azra Kwesi. For 17 years, you've been going back and forth to Africa documenting our story. The first question I want to ask is, what's the significance or what's the detriment of having a European perception of Christ, or particularly having a deity that doesn't even look like us as a people?
Spiritual enslavement. When you have someone who is looked at as the deity, is not in your image, that is where the enemy has become the deity. Historically, white people have been the enemy to African people. We in fact look at the deity as being a God figure. Then this is where we say the enemy has become the deity. This is in fact spiritual enslavement.
Let me ask you a question. From the standpoint of self-identity, how do you respond to brothers and sisters who say, well, look, I'm not from Africa, I'm from Detroit, or I'm from Chicago?
Even when you look at Detroit and Chicago, even in that, black people are not from there. We migrated there from the South. See, so the foundation of how we got even to those cities was a migration from the South, and then how we get to the South is because the slave ships docked at the South. So we've got to continue to go back. Again, when someone says that too, is a part of a self-deep inflicted wound of hatred. The lack of knowledge of who we are will cause you to say anything negative about yourself, and this is what has happened to African peoples. Talk to a Chinese person, they don't tell you they're not Chinese, they're from California, and from China. They set up a Chinatown, and they gave the ethnic identity of their town China because they're from China. And as long as we are locked up into that thinking, we will never become a people who have power in this country. We will always have our money circulating in somebody else's communities. We will not find ourselves taking that resource, that economic resources, and start building in our own community. So we've got to understand, to build an African town, we've got to understand the power behind understanding who we are and our own ethnic identity and building on that power, not from individualism, but from a collective effort as an African people.
So that was Armon Rashidi, just sharing some thoughts on what he describes as spiritual enslavement. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move in to the strategy of Malcolm X, or continue now with the strategy of Malcolm X. So we're at 4.13, Malcolm X's two-pronged approach to African liberation. This analysis helped to provide one of the distinguishing features of Malcolm X's strategy, i.e. the two-pronged approach to African liberation. One, the internal struggle of diasporan African people fighting the capitalist system in its own centres, and two, the international struggle of diasporan African people in the capitalist centres, which involves them linking up with oppressed people, oppressed African and non-African communities around the world to fight the international capitalist structure. Let's just say this, that what Malcolm X is doing is he is focusing on the diasporan part of the African world population. So a distinction is being drawn between African people at home on the motherland who are part of a particular process, and African people dispersed in other parts of the world, which we call the diaspora. So we who live here in England, for instance, are part of the diaspora. And so Malcolm X's role, his strategic role, was leading the diaspora. One of the hidden parts of the strategy, because the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah was leading the overall strategy. But his friend, Malcolm X, was asked to lead the diasporan part of the strategy. And so you see a change in Malcolm that happens for those that have taken time to study him. When he starts, in the mid-60s, when he comes into notoriety, early to mid-60s, he talks about Afro-Americans. And in the early part, he says that there are 22 million Afro-Americans. That's the language that he uses. 22 million Afro-Americans. But later, he starts to talk about 100 million Afro-Americans. Just 2 or 3 years later, he's now talking about 100 million Afro-Americans. So, we're talking about an increase of 78 million. Where did that increase come from? Well, that increase was from a change in his perspective. He spoke about 22 million before he had, serious discussions with Kwame Nkrumah. And after those serious discussions with Kwame Nkrumah, he then started to talk about Afro-Americans, to use his language, being 100 million people. And it's because he changed the frame. 22 million referred to the number at that time of African people in US Satan, inside the borders of US Satan. But after speaking to the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, he broadened the scope. It was not just African people in US Satan. It was African people in Canada. It was African people in Mexico and other parts of Central America. It was African people in South America. It was African people in the Caribbean. It was also African people in Europe. And this is why Malcolm X came over to Europe before he was assassinated, visited this country, visited France and other places. He was visiting the African communities in those various locations, so that Afro-American actually included those of us that were here in its new definition. And he regarded us as Afro-American because many of us who are in Europe actually came from the Americas. Remember, the Caribbean is in the Americas. And so when we migrated over here, we were migrated from the Americas. Jamaica is in the Americas. Dominica, St. Lucia, Barbados, etc. are in the Americas. And so he saw us as Afro-Americans. If you look at France, Martinique and Guadeloupe, for instance, they've got big populations in France. They are from the Americas. Those are islands in the Caribbean. And so on. If you look at Holland, as an example, Bonaire, Curaçao, what's the other one? It's the ABC, Aruba. Those islands, were under Dutch colonialism. The people that came over from those islands into Holland, they were Afro-Americans in the definition, the new definition that Malcolm X was actually using. So what he's doing in his two-pronged approach is he's saying that his particular focus is African people in the diaspora, and his job is to unite African people across the entire diaspora. Now, remembering, of course, that what was going on in Africa at the time, this is not separate from what's going on in Africa, but it's distinct. It's like a branch, it's like a department of the overall equation. And what was going on in Africa at that point in time is the leaders there were coming together to try and create the OAU, the Organization of African Unity. And so the organization that Malcolm X set up, he set up two organizations. He set one up called Muslim Mosque Incorporated. That was a religious organization, for Muslim believers. But he set up a liberation organization separate from it. Anybody could join it, regardless of what your religion was. And that one was called, any African, of course, could join it, regardless of what your religion was. And that one was called the OAU, the Organization of Afro-American Unity. So he was mimicking the structure that was being created in the motherland in order that the two can ultimately be joined together. And this was the agreement, the secret agreement that was in place between the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, who was leading the overall strategy, and Malcolm X, who was leading the diasporan part of that strategy. Now, reading on, through the gallant efforts of the continental African masses, the African motherland was experiencing a prolific phase of independence. However, Africa was still not free. African people on the motherland were held down by colonialism, settler colonialism, and neo-colonialism. It was therefore necessary to help to create a situation where Africa was ripe for liberation. In order to create such conditions, capitalism had to be attacked on several fronts across the whole world simultaneously. These simultaneous assaults would force capitalism to spread its resources thinly across the globe. This in turn would mean that it could not hold down all of its colonies at once. This would leave the way clear for some of the colonies to break away from capitalist control, emancipate themselves, and then fight for the freedom of those colonies that had not yet broken away. So what we see here is a strategy of spreading the imperialist enemy thin. If the imperialist enemy is holding down 50 colonies at once in various places across the world, and of course it's more than that, but if that's what it has to do, if the 50 are coordinated, and if they rise at the same time, the imperialists do not have enough resources to send military backup to all of those places at once. And so then what happens is some of them break away. And as they break away, they reduce the power of imperialism. And as they organize, the ones that are broken away, as they organize, they then can assist those that have not yet broken away. So there's an actual, there's a sequential strategy that's operating, that Malcolm X was operating. Reading on. However, in order to achieve this level of coordination, alliances were necessary with groups of non-Africans who, because they were similarly oppressed by capitalism, had a lot to gain from its destruction. The African liberation movement in US Satan had experienced significant setbacks. And we're talking about the African liberation movement has experienced significant setbacks from alliances with non-African forces. These setbacks were often the result of the US Satan government's underhand destructive influences. This was evidence that allies could not necessarily be trusted, but it was not evidence that it was tactically incorrect to engage in alliances with non-Africans. Future alliances would be struck internationally, mostly outside the legal jurisdiction of US Satan, as a tactic to reduce its undermining and destructive influences. So, there's the need for African people in the diaspora, which is what Malcolm X was working on, to link up with fellow African people. There's that need. But there is also a need to link up with non-Africans, people who are not Africans. Not because we think we're the same as them. Not because we think that all of our problems are the same as theirs. But because they have a common enemy. They're trying to get away from that common enemy, the same enemy that we're trying to get away from. And if we organize ourselves and coordinate our efforts and strike simultaneously, one of us or both of us will get away and start to effect our liberation and freedom. And when one gets away, they don't just stop there. They continue to see what they can do to assist those that have not yet got away. So look at Cuba as an example. Cuba got away in 1959 with the Cuban Revolution. US Satanists tried to subdue Cuba every day since then. But Cuba has resisted. But not only has it resisted, it has actually used its resources to help other oppressed people. So for instance, Cuba sent military support to our people in Angola. The MPLA in the 1970s to assist the liberation struggle. It was 1970s and 1980s, by the way, to assist the liberation struggles of African people. That is serious, tangible help. When the people in Guinea-Bissau, the Guinea-Bissau part of Africa, were fighting for their liberation, Cuba set up a radio broadcasting station that broadcast across the Atlantic, where they were able to pick up more information of what was happening on the ground than the people in Guinea-Bissau through international networks. And they were able to beam that information back into Guinea-Bissau to help the African people in Guinea-Bissau to win that liberation struggle. So these are two examples of solidarity that we've received. Now, other examples of solidarity that we've received. In Zimbabwe, when the liberation war was happening in Zimbabwe, what was called the Chimurenga, the second Chimurenga. The first Chimurenga happened in 1896 when, under the leaderships of greats like Nehanda, our mother, Nehanda, we fought against the European colonizers as they came in to take over our land. But the second Chimurenga, which happened in the 1960s and 70s and culminated in the Lancaster House Agreement, which happened in 1979, and Independence, which happened in 1980, where Bob Marley actually sang at the independence celebrations. That's that. In that second Chimurenga, we did the fighting, but we were supplied with arms. There were two branches of the Liberation Front. One was called ZANU, and the ZANU was under the leadership of Robert Mugabe. The other one was called ZAPU, and ZAPU was under the leadership of Joshua Nkomo. ZANU was comprised of mainly Shona people. So there are two large tribal groupings in Zimbabwe. The Shona people were under the leadership of Robert Mugabe through ZANU, and the Ndebele people were under the leadership of Joshua Nkomo through ZAPU. And ZANU and ZAPU together, they had their differences, but together they were fighting against the settler colonial common enemy, led by a character by the name of Ian Smith. And the reason I'm mentioning this is the solidarity. One example of solidarity was the Chinese supplied arms to ZANU, and the Russians supplied arms to ZAPU. You see, they would not have had the arms that they needed to finish the job, to defeat the Europeans, had they not had those alliances. So Malcolm X was emphasizing the importance of alliances with non-Africans who have who hold our enemy as a common enemy. Continuing. However, in order to achieve this level of coordination, alliances were necessary with groups of non-Africans who, because they were similarly oppressed by capitalism, had a lot to gain from its destruction. The African liberation movement in US Satan had experienced significant setbacks from alliances with non-African forces in US Satan. These setbacks were often the result of US Satan government underhanded destructive influences. This was evidence that allies could not necessarily be trusted, but it was not evidence that it was tactically incorrect to engage with alliances with non-Africans. Future alliances would be struck internationally, mostly outside the legal jurisdiction of US Satan, as a tactic to reduce its undermining and destructive influences. Moving on to the next section, 4.14, the necessity of effective government. It was impossible to achieve these aims or any part of the African liberation strategy without the creation of an effective African liberation organization. The building of an effective organization would give African people in the diaspora the power to act in their best interest. The organization that Malcolm X was creating was a vehicle for carrying forward the specific actions required by the strategy. For strategy was the organization of Afro-American unity. The organization of Afro-American unity's primary purpose was to unite all African people in the Western diaspora. It would be a fighting organization operating for diasporan African people's self-defense and freedom. It would prosecute the diasporan element of the African liberation strategy on two fronts. One, the internal battlefront, and two, the international battlefront. So let's just be clear, the internal battlefront for us is where we are. It's the front line of our activity. It is the police deaths in custody. It is the exclusion from schools that I was mentioning. It is the overrepresentation of African people in unemployment. It is the lower life expectancy of African people in the towns and cities and nations that we find ourselves in. So we have to battle against these things. We have to make our situation better where we are. And this was the internal battlefront that Malcolm X was talking about. And the second part was the international battlefront, which means that, yes, we have to fight where we are, but we also have to fight globally. And that's where the alliances come in. But before we get to alliances, we have to link up with our sisters and brothers globally. And so that's all part of the international battlefront. Reading on. It would also employ political education as a vital tool in the process of taking control of African majority communities, and beyond that for transforming the revolutionary consciousness of its members. So, in the diaspora, there are some places where we are the majority. In the Caribbean, African people are the majority. And so it's only right that we should take charge of the Caribbean. We're the majority, so let's just take charge of it. In Brazil, we're the majority, but we're not in charge of it. So there's something that has to be corrected in Brazil as an example. In some countries, we are not the majority in the country, but in certain communities we're the majority. So in Harlem, in New York, we're the majority. You know? And so it's only right that we should take charge of that community and run it in our own interest, in our best interests. And so this was all part of the approach, the strategy of Malcolm X. Now, that strategy, we're finding that countered by Europeans. They've understood that strategy and they're countering it. And so one of the things that they're doing is they're engaging in what I call an ethnic cleansing process. So if you look at London, say 30 years ago, you would see that there were two boroughs where Europeans were outnumbered. The first of those, with 53%, as I think it was in the 1990s, non-Europeans, was Newham. Large Asian population, some Africans there too, but together they outnumbered Europeans. And the other one was in northwest London, Brent, the London Borough of Brent, which had 51% back in the 1990s. Large Asian population, large African population, and together they outnumbered the European population in Brent. So what Malcolm is saying is that those communities should be run by the majority population. And now what they've done, as these communities have built up, is they've started to remove particularly African people from these areas. They send them, they've got campaigns where they send them to live in strange parts of the country, hundreds of miles away from their relatives, etc. But the other thing that they are encouraging is a moving out of what was regarded as the inner cities into the suburbs, where the Europeans are easily dominant in numerical terms. And so African people then think they're moving up in social status. They're going to live in places where there's a massive majority, European majority population. But that is calculated to depopulate the centres where African people are concentrated in high numbers, so that we're spread across a wider area. We're spread in a way that means that we cannot control any area. We are the minority wherever we are. This is all part of the social engineering that they have organised in order to keep us, from taking control of those areas. So if you're following Malcolm X's strategy, he's saying that we must, live together. We must take charge of the areas in which we live. And then we must put the resources of that area to use for the advancement of our people. Right, so the OAAU's primary purpose was to unite all African people in the Western diaspora. It would be a fighting organisation operating for diasporan African people's self-defence and freedom. It would prosecute the diasporan element of the African liberation strategy on the internal and the external front. It would also employ political education as a vital tool in the process of taking control of African majority communities, and beyond that, for transforming the revolutionary consciousness of its members. Now we move on to the next section. The next section, 4.2, the internal battlefront. So, Malcolm was describing two battlefronts, internal and external. Now we're going to look a little bit more at the internal battlefront. Yeah, a revolution in the belly of the capitalist beast. That's the heading. 4.2, the internal battlefront, revolution in the belly of the capitalist beast. And 4.21, the subheading is African battlefronts are part of a world full of battlefronts. Reading on, Malcolm X understood that in a situation of worldwide revolutionary war, there would be a multiplicity of different but related battlefronts located around the world. Some of these battlefronts would be in the heart of the capitalist centres. African people in capitalist centres, such as US Satan, were therefore in a critical battlefront. Against that background, the first duty was to unite with other African people in their localities in order to defend themselves and contribute to the destruction of capitalism. African people's next duty was to consolidate their positions by linking forces with other oppressed groups in the capitalist centres. These coalitions could then use their combined strength to confront capitalism from within at its weakest point. Capitalism's internal battlefronts and the role of oppressed groups within them were critical because of the nature of the struggle. They could ultimately help to destroy the capitalist beast from within. So what Malcolm is telling us is that we are in the belly of the capitalist beast. And our job is to give that beast a bellyache. That's our job. We're in the belly. It's our enemy. Give it a bellyache. And he says that the first part to giving it a bellyache is to organize as African people inside its belly, to create strong organizations of African people. And then, and we're talking about local organizations now. So if you're in Tottenham, you should have a strong, Tottenham-based African organization. And then he's saying that that local-based organization should then link up with other local-based organizations, non-African organizations. So it should be willing to work with non-African organizations in the Tottenham area. Now that is not its primary working group, but it is its primary area. And if you work collectively with other oppressed people, you may find that within that collective, you have a majority, and through that collective, you're able to run your locality as a collective. So that's one part of the strategy. But the other thing that he's saying to us is that African people in the local area must link with broader African groupings. So if you're an African organization here in Tottenham, for instance, you should then link with, African organizations in Brixton, African organizations in Hackney, African organizations in Brent, African organizations across London. And they should come together to form an umbrella organization of African organizations. So those African organizations are not just loose entities by themselves, but they are part of an African network of organizations. So this is what Malcolm has explained to us. And then that goes even further. That umbrella grouping should link up with a national grouping. So that African organizations in London should link with those in Birmingham, should link with those in Leeds, should link with those in Manchester and Liverpool, and so on, until you have a national network of African organizations. And those African organizations would all be linking with non-African organizations in their areas, but their main organization setting would be the linkage with African organizations around the country. And then the next phase is for the African organization nationwide to link with African organizations in other nations. That's the next phase. As we do that, we then develop a strong international network. So our duty as a national organization of African people would be to link with a national organization of African people in France, a national organization of African people in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, and so on. This would be our duty in Holland and all of these places to create an international, European-wide network. And then that would have a duty of linking in with networks that are in existence in South America, in North America, in Central America, in the Caribbean. This is what Malcolm X was building, so that internally, as Africans, we have a diasporan-wide organization catering for the needs of, at that time, 100 million African people. We are now 400 million in the diaspora. Well, 350 to 400 million in the African diaspora. And so we need to organize ourselves politically. And this is what Malcolm X was working on. Just reading on. It was essential that the struggle on capitalism's internal battlefront was unified and highly organized. Any African organization operating on this front had to actively engage in political education of diasporan African people. This would contribute to raising their understanding of their common quest for justice. It would also have to focus on those aspects that unite African people, such as the common struggle against racial oppression. Conversely, it would have to de-emphasize the contentious areas which tend to promote divisions and splits, such as religious differences. So we're now beginning to see the kind of structures that Malcolm is talking about. Our primary structure is for us to unite amongst ourselves as African people. That's our primary structure. But it's not our only structure. In addition to uniting amongst ourselves across the entire diaspora, we're also making linkages with other people who have the same enemy as us. And we strengthen each other through those linkages. But our primary allegiance is to ourselves as African people. 4.22. Organize self-defense on the internal battlefront. All of these conditions contributed to the creation of what Malcolm's African-focused organization, the OAAU, the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Its internal role was to focus on the issues that impacted the the diaspora and African communities locally. It was given the specific remit of actively involving itself in all issues affecting diaspora and African people in local communities. Its job was to lead the organized struggle of diaspora and African people in the belly of the capitalist beast. That struggle would be multidimensional, taking on both defensive and proactive postures. Its defensive task included fighting all the negative political, economic, social conditions confronting African communities. Among other things, this meant tackling problems posed by landlords, for instance, who are ill-treating our people, politicians and merchants who pimp off of the African diasporan community through highly organized, sometimes even institutionalized systems of theft. They'd call it business, but it's really a kind of theft that's going on. How other people come and just pimp off of our community, and we end up making other communities rich and not gaining for ourselves. Problems such as bad housing, bad schooling, and inferior jobs which plagued diaspora and African communities. The problem of organized crime, which was really controlled from behind the scenes by policemen carrying out a policy of anti-diasporan African containment. So Malcolm X is quite clear that what we think of as crime, it's real, but much of it is organized by the state to keep us in a state. And 4, evils and vices such as alcoholism, drug addiction, and prostitution that were destroying the moral fibre of African majority communities. Wherever you are, or where African people are, you find these things, drugs, etc., etc. You know, we don't grow it. It's imported, you know. And there's somebody, or there are some people who are specifically directing these things towards us. Malcolm's investigation, and he knew because he was a criminal, so he knew how it ran. And he told us that it's the police that organise it. 4.23. Proactive organisation on the internal battlefront. Reading on. Through its role in fighting the racism of the capitalist system and its local manifestations, the Organization of Afro-American Unity would automatically expose violations of diaspora and African peoples' human rights. The Organization of Afro-American Unity would then highlight these violations internationally as part of its proactive strategy. It would embarrass the capitalist system by linking with the continental-based Organization of African Unity to highlight capitalism's internal racist abuses in the international arenas, such as the United Nations. Now, let's be clear here. That there was a difference on this issue between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Malcolm X, brilliant though his work was, he was working towards civil rights. Malcolm X had a higher level of understanding, and he was working towards African people's human rights. There's a difference between human rights and civil rights. Civil rights are contained within the borders of a particular nation state. So it's the job of the state is to guarantee your civil rights. And your civil rights are not the business of any state outside of that state. It's only the business of the state that you're in. So our civil rights are only the business of Britain. For instance, those of us that are here living in Britain. It's none of the business of nations outside Britain. That's political etiquette. That's political protocol. But human rights transcend borders. You see, if you violate human rights, or if a state violates human rights, because they are so fundamental, then even though states don't often do it, they can comment. Notice how US Satan criticizes China for what it calls human rights violations. Notice how it goes around criticizing lots of other... I mean, it's the biggest human right violator in the world, but it criticizes other states, saying that they violate human rights. It uses the violation of human rights, what it claims are violations of human rights, as pretext for invading. You know, it was invading Iraq, it claimed, to protect Iraqi people. You know, white men speak with forked tongue. Yeah. It invaded, where else? Afghanistan, for the protection, it claimed, of the Afghanistanis. It was invading Syria, it claimed, for the protection of Syrian people, and so on. They lie like hell, but, you know, that's the pretext that they use, because human rights are elevated to a higher level, where a nation outside the nation in which it occurs can comment on it. So what Malcolm X was doing, Malcolm X was saying that we need to argue our case as African people at the level of human rights, not civil rights. Because if we argue the way that Martin Luther King was doing the civil rights, we play into their hands. So his strategy was to talk about civil rights and then go to the same people that are violating those civil rights and try to ask them to be good and behave themselves and, treat us better in future. That was his strategy. Yeah, it was never going to work in a racist nation like US Satan. Yeah, Malcolm's strategy was to say, look, these are human rights. I'm going to go to the United Nations and I'm going to speak to the United Nations and I'm going to say, look, this is what you're doing to us. You're shooting us down in the street. You're expelling our children from school. You're doing all kinds of wickedness to us. This is human rights. And then what that means is that other nations can comment on it and shame US Satan, and in that way bring pressure to bear on them. This is also indicative of what was going on internationally in Africa. So there was a relationship between Haile Selassie and US Satan. US Satan was pumping a lot of money into Haile Selassie's Ethiopia. So he sided with US Satan on this issue. He sided against Malcolm X on this issue. And when in 1963 they had the inaugural conference for the Organization of African Unity, it was held in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, the capital of Ethiopia, and Haile Selassie was the host as the leader of Ethiopia, and he used his position as host to prevent Malcolm X and other diasporan Africans from speaking at the conference, because Malcolm X wanted to come to that conference and he wanted to say our human rights have been violated. But what Haile Selassie did is that he defended US Satan, who were pumping lots of money into Ethiopia at the time, and used his position as host to stop it, so that Malcolm X was not permitted to participate, not even attend, let alone speak, in that conference. Now, at the same time, Kwame Nkrumah, remember Kwame Nkrumah was really leading, and Malcolm X was leading one of his departments, the diasporan department. At the same time, Kwame Nkrumah was arguing that he should be allowed to come and he should be able to make the point that our human rights are being violated in US Satan. But he was overruled because the host has more power. You have to respect your host. And so what then happened is Kwame Nkrumah and the other progressive leaders of Africa invited Malcolm X to the second meeting of the Organization of African Unity, which happened in Cairo afterwards. And so Malcolm X spoke at that conference, the second conference of Afro-American Unity. Haile Selassie still protested, but he couldn't stop it because he was not the host, and others were determined that Malcolm X should speak. Kwame Nkrumah, top of that list, but also Nasser of Egypt supported, supported that Malcolm X should speak, and so Haile Selassie was overruled, and Malcolm X came to that conference and spoke. And it was, but he also was helped by Kwame Nkrumah to speak at the United Nations, and he used that as an opportunity to embarrass US Satan for the evil and wickedness that they were inflicting on African people. So all of this is important to understand the strategy of Malcolm X. And as we read on, the OAAU's proactive agenda was not limited to merely embarrassing capitalism. Its proactive task also meant that it had to gain political, economic, social and social control of the main structures in the diasporan African communities. And this meant, so in other words, it's not just a case of fighting against the bad things. We have to fight against the bad things. but we must also take control to make things better for ourselves. So this meant, reading on, organising voter registration drives accompanied by political education aimed at taking control of diasporan African majority neighbourhoods. 2. Developing diasporan African-owned shops, businesses and industries aimed at creating community self-employment. 3. Establish independent publishing ventures and other media communications. 4. Encouraging the establishment of diasporan-run experimental institutions, educational workshops, liberation schools and child centres. And 5. Creating and maintaining technical pools of skilled diasporan African people for deployment around the African world. You see, that last one is very, very important. Those of us who live in places like USA and places like Britain, we have access to new technology in a way that many of our people at home do not have. So, we have access to business schools and those types of things in a way that many of our people back home do not have. And so we are in a position, if we study and learn in the environment that we're in a position then to be able to go back and share that learning on the motherland. So if you are a scientist over here, and we're going back now sort of 50, 60 years now, if you're a scientist over here, imagine how beneficial you would be to an African nation if you were able to go and create, using your science knowledge in the motherland, or to teach and create other scientists in the motherland. So being close to the new technology, being close to the new avenues of learning, etc., has put us in a privileged position, and we should be ready to bring the knowledge that we've gained back to our sisters and brothers on the motherland. What's happened in the meantime, of course, is our sisters and brothers on the motherland, if you go to Nigeria, they've got more universities there than Britain. So that gap, to some extent, over the last 50 years has been broken down, but it's still not completely broken down, and we still have a duty to bring what we can to the table for our sisters and brothers in the motherland. Reading on. In fact, let me see. Before reading on, actually, I think what I'll do is I'll just play something very quickly from Arman Rashidi and come back immediately after the break.
Thousands of years ago, there stood a great African warrior king, Ra Ursa Mayat Ra, Semtepid Ra, Remetsu Meriaman. This majestic ruler who reigned for over 60 years. A legendary master builder and historical revealer, cunning and strong, corrector of both right and wrong. As he walked the streets of Kemet, the African people would cheer. And he stood one day at the Giza Plateau, marveling at Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure. He recalled the pyramids that we'd built, 48 stories high, 755 feet wide, 2,003,000 stones, some stones weighing over 3,000 tons in the inner casing. This great warrior king marveled at the system of mathematics that he knew his people had created. And with a great ambience, he stood at the base, and he walked back down the corridor that he would lay the rest tonight. His queen joined him, but in the middle of the night, he woke up in a cold sweat from a nightmare. His queen looked at him, but she'd never seen him this way before, so she never said a word. He laid down again, and in the middle of the night, he He awoke screaming at the top of his lungs. His queen still didn't trouble him. But the next morning as Ra rose, as he gazed into the sun, she said, "My king, last night you were troubled. What was it that bothered you?" And he slowly and methodically looked up into her eyes and he said, "Last night I had a dream and I saw things that I'd never seen. I saw black men killing one another. I saw black children disrespecting their mothers. I saw black armies gone down in defeat. I saw black babies saying things even I wouldn't repeat. I saw the pyramid builders, once so wealthy and once so wise, now smoking crack and committing suicide. I saw an African queen being called a bitch. I saw an African king wallowing in a ditch. I saw black people who once loved one another become separated because of class, status, and color. I saw ministers of God lying to people who believe just to obtain a dollar is what they hope to achieve. But then things got so bad and it made me so sad until I screamed to God like I never had. And I cried, send them a message and make it loud and clear. Don't give up now because freedom is too near. You've been too black, too bold, too whole, too cold, too strong, too long to allow this nonsense to continue on. You gave sight to the blind when others could not see. You gave refuge to those who were lost and allowed them to be. You built pyramids when others lived in caves. You gave the world a year with 365 and a fourth days. You gave hope to the shameless and names to the nameless. But what will you do now that you're not so famous? Stop sacrificing your dreams for the illusion of security. Stop acting like a child and obtain your maturity. Stop looking to others for what you can do for yourself. Dust off your ambition and take it off the shelf. Start living your life and stop waiting on death. Stop waiting on time, for there is no time left. For our God only helps those who will help themselves. Peace out.
So we just have a little bit of Arman Rashidi there operating in the background. If we can make time, we'll see if we can slip another tune from Arman Rashidi in before the end of the program. But now, let's read on. We're on section 4.32 now. Internationalist cooperation means each people are responsible for their own front. So that's the heading. International cooperation means that each people are responsible for their own front. Reading on. However, there were also battlefronts which would be located outside of Africa and outside of the capitalist centers. They would be located in other colonized nations in other continents. Whatever our differences with these other groups of people, we had a common interest in defeating the capitalist enemy and freeing ourselves from the racism of capitalism, the most oppressive force on earth. The victories of oppressed people in these non-African battlefronts would also indirectly contribute to the process of African liberation by weakening Africa's capitalist oppressor enemies. All African people, therefore, had a vested interest in the victories of these other oppressed groups. So, for instance, we ask ourselves, do we have an interest in the Vietnamese War? Well, yes, of course we do. We want the Vietnamese to defeat the US Satan imperialists. US Satan has no business being there. So naturally, it's not their land, etc. So naturally, our sympathy will be with the Vietnamese people who are defending their land. Where US Satan goes into Iraq, into Afghanistan, into Syria, naturally our sympathy is with the people of the land. Now they've realized that nobody has sympathy with them when they go around invading other nations. So they've been cunning, and what they've done is they have used their finances to pay groups internally to say that the governments are corrupt, to say that the governments are doing wicked things, and the governments may be actually corrupt. The governments may be doing wicked things. But wicked things are not the reason for the invasion. Because we know that there are many governments doing wicked things that US Satan doesn't invade. If the government is doing wicked things, but is doing what US Satan wants them to do, there'll be no invasion. If they're doing wicked things and they are operating in a way that US Satan doesn't like, there may well be an invasion. And even if they're not doing wicked things but are operating in a way that US Satan doesn't like, there may be an invasion. The Trump character has made it very clear that he's invading for oil. He's not even hiding it. The rest of them were a little bit more subtle. He's not even hiding it. Yeah, and so we're on the side of the people. We're on the side of the Vietnamese people in their war with US Satan. We're on the side of the Iraqi people in their war against US Satan. We're on the side of the Syrian people in their war against US Satan. We're on the side of the Afghanistani people in their war against US Satan, and so on. So we have a vested interest which is in opposition to the colonialists, the imperialists, who are going into other people's lands and fighting. So we have a natural affinity with those that are oppressed. Reading on. Whilst it was the duty of other oppressed groups to fight on their own battlefronts and not the responsibility of African people, all African people had a duty to coordinate with them to make their joint battles against capitalism more effective. Similarly, non-African groups suffering the oppression of capitalism had a duty to coordinate with African people struggling for freedom to make African battlefronts against capitalism more effective. Non-Africans had no place in the African liberation struggle unless African liberation organizations invited them. The African battlefronts, together with how to prosecute liberation wars on those fronts, are the domain of African people in that region. So let's be very clear that one of the things that happens, particularly European groups on the left, is they kind of turn up in our battles and then they think they're in charge. They think it's their job to tell us what to do. We've had that kind of battle with them for decades now. Malcolm is saying very clearly that, if you're going to come onto our battlefront, you only come when we invite you. Otherwise, you stay out. Keep your nose out of our business. But if we invite you in, if we're kind enough to invite you in, then you operate under our orders. We run things in our battles, and you operate under our orders. These are very important principles, because in a world where other people think they're superior to Africans, there's a danger that they come in as allies and think that they're in charge. So Malcolm was making it very clear that it doesn't happen that way. That if we invite you in, if we don't invite you in, you can't come. That's the first thing. But if we do invite you in, we run things. Very, very important point. Continue on. African and other oppressed people could supply each other with vital immaterial support, including the provision of appropriate training, as well as information about the tactics, capacity, morale, and location of enemy forces. At the material level, they could supply each other with much needed military hardware to help prosecute the armed struggle phase of liberation campaigns. It is the reciprocal benefits of supporting each other's activities on a worldwide multi-fronted revolutionary battlefronts that provides the basis for working alliances between African people and other oppressed groups. Conversely, worldwide worldwide revolution is impossible without local and international revolutionary and anti-imperialist alliances. Revolutionary alliances are the lifeblood of the worldwide revolutionary process. They are absolutely essential for the removal of the capitalist order. So we must be prepared to engage in alliances with non-Africans as part of the overall liberation process. We're in charge of African liberation now. We're not talking about, giving up our rights to be in charge of our own liberation. The principle is very simple. We look after our doorstep, you look after yours. And where we can help each other, we help each other. But it's not our job to go and fight your battles, and it definitely is not your job to come and fight ours. So that's the kind of thinking that underpins alliances and working in alliance. Now we're moving on to section 4.3.3, entitled Summary of Strategic Actions on the International Battlefront. Reading on. Malcolm X's approach to the international element of his African liberation strategy can be summarized into the following 6 points. So this is the international element. Let me just recap. Yeah. So the core element of the strategy of Malcolm X is that we organize as African people. Our first base of organization is our locality. For those of us in London, the various communities that we're in London, that's the first base of organization. Then we build up to London-wide, we build up to nationwide, we build up internationally, all as an organization. And that organization that Malcolm was building was called the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And all of those would have been formed part of that overall umbrella organization for the diaspora. And then that diaspora African organization would link in with the overall umbrella for African liberation. So there was an overall umbrella for African liberation, which was the OAU. And it failed in the task, but in principle that was what was trying to be organized, and that was organized on the basis of regions. So you had North, South, East, West and Central, and then to that you would add what Malcolm X was building, which was the diaspora, the OAAU, and then when you put those together you then have an umbrella organization encompassing African people all over the world. So Malcolm was building that part, or the diasporan part of that overall umbrella or organization. And now what we're looking at is the linkages between the diasporan African element, which is obviously a part of the overall African element, but its linkages with non-Africans. So that's what's been summarized here. Yeah, and it can be summarized in the following 6 points. 1. Support organized unity among African people on the African continent. So we have a duty, and it's our first duty, to support the main organization on the African continent, which at that time would have been the Organization of African Unity. That is our first duty, our primary duty as a global African diaspora grouping. Then secondly, organized unity between African people in US Satan and African people in other parts of the Western diaspora. So the second duty is, from Malcolm X's point of view, is for him to link up with African people in, the rest of North America, in Central America, in South America, in Canada, in Europe, etc. For us, who are African diasporans in Europe, our duty, our secondary duty, is to link up with African diasporans in the Americas, North, South, East, West, North, South, Central, and Caribbean, etc. So that duty is incumbent on us to link up to create a truly representative and strong umbrella organization for African diasporans. The third point is organized unity between African people in the diaspora and repatriated diasporan African people on the continent. So one of the trends that's happening at the moment is people are moving back to Africa. People who have lived in the diaspora, they're moving back to Africa. Some of them came directly from Africa to here, lived here for a while and have gone back. Some of us, who are children of people who came here from the Caribbean, for instance, are also going back to Africa. And what Malcolm is saying is that the people that go home to Africa have a duty to set themselves up as diasporan Africans in Africa, and then to lobby the governments in Africa to do their job in protecting African people in the diaspora. So there's a particular role for African people in the diaspora. You don't just go home and forget about the fact that you were in the diaspora. You go home, but you maintain the linkages in order that we can have effective communications between us. The fourth point is linking the struggles on the African continent with Western diasporan struggles through umbrella organizations. So we have to ask ourselves internally, as African people, how can we help our sisters and brothers in the motherland for their lives to be better? And they in the motherland must ask themselves, how can we help to make the lives of their sisters and brothers, us here in the diaspora, better? What can we do to help each other? That's got to be part of the discussion. That's got to be part of the debate. So our role in the diaspora, for instance, may be to embarrass badly behaved governments back in Africa. That may be one of our jobs. If you've got a badly behaved government in Africa, killing people, for instance, and some of them do, if you're in Africa and you try to stand up to them, that's like a death wish. But at least if we're here and we make complaints and we bring our complaints to governments in the Western Hemisphere, it would then embarrass the badly behaved government back in Africa, and hopefully encourage them to behave better in future. So there are ways that we can help each other, and we've got to maintain the linkages so that we can work out what those ways are and act on them. And the fifth point is organized anti-imperialist solidarity with oppressed non-Europeans locally and internationally. So there are other people in the world who experience racism. No people experience it with the intensity that African people do now. Let's be very clear on this. But, Asians experience racism also. Yeah? So there is common ground for us to work with them. And you remember, those of you that have studied Malcolm, you remember that Malcolm often used to speak of the Bandung Conference, which happened in 1955. And the Bandung Conference was the coming together of African and Asian nations. Also, there were some South American nations involved. It was the coming together of those groupings to join, a common purpose. So areas where we could help each other, we would help each other. Even though our struggles were not identical, even though, the African situation is not the same as the Asian situation, there are enough commonalities between the two for us to have areas where we are able to cooperate to the mutual benefit of the parties involved in that cooperation. So, Bandung was a manifestation of that, and Malcolm X was really quite a champion of the Bandung process. And the sixth and final one on the list is organized anti-imperialist solidarity with oppressed Europeans, locally and internationally. So, Europeans are not subject to racism. They don't experience racism. But they do have certain types of oppression. They experience class oppression, for instance. So this is why they had to create things like trade unions. Because they are experiencing a form of oppression from their elite. And so in Malcolm X's strategy, what he's saying is, even though they're racist, we need to make linkages with them, not on the basis of their racism, but on the basis that they are experiencing a certain amount of oppression too, and in that sense would have a desire that their oppressors are gone. This is very important, because we certainly, the Europeans have been very good at dividing African people. And you have got to be very good at dividing people that stand in your way. And when you actually address workers on the basis of their class issue, even though they're united on the issue of racism, on the practice of racism against us with their elite, when we engage with the workers, at one level we're actually splitting the racists. And it's important to understand that they can be split. And Brexit has taught us, yes, they can be split. Brexit has taught us this. For many a year, we've perhaps been deluded into or fooled into believing that they are intensely united. And certainly when it comes to anything against African people, they unite 100%. Not one of them will step out of place when it comes to racism. They all know what to do even without communicating. They know what to do. They know whose side they're on. But Brexit shows us that it is possible to split them. And so, tactically, we should be trying to split them, but also tactically, we should be trying to work constructively in areas with their workers where it is possible to work constructively. It's not always going to be possible now, but where it is possible, we should try to work constructively to achieve that. So reading on, the execution of these international standards, the execution of these international strands of the strategy meant that the OAU had to undertake the critical task of educating African people to understand, the OAAU, that's the Organization of Afro-American Unity, had to take the critical task of educating African people to understand the importance of internationalism. The common denominator binding all the above mentioned subgroups together is that they all have something positive to gain from the destruction of capitalism. Malcolm X understood that it was necessary to raise the consciousness of all members of each of the subgroups to a point of realizing the direct benefits to them of working cooperatively with other oppressed people. It was the OAAU's task, the Organization of Afro-American Unity's task, to ensure that African people in the diaspora fully understood the need for internationalist, that is, global anti-imperialist alliances, linkages, and acts of solidarity. So, that more or less covers the strategy of Malcolm X. I'm going to also talk about the relationship between Malcolm X and Kwame Nkrumah a little bit. In the book, it goes into, it gives a little bit of an explanation of the relationship between the two. But what I'll do in the meantime is I'll just, I think there's enough time for me just to allow Arman Rashidi to share another tune with us.
Reality check 101. Conversation piece. Just something to stimulate the brain. Why the brain? Because the brain is so powerful that 70% of all the oxygen that flows to the body goes to the brain, and the brain does not even move. The only reason that you have eyes is because the brain wants to see. The only reason you have hands is because the brain wants to touch. The only reason that you have ears is because the brain wants to hear. Now, if the brain is so powerful, then why do we use it so little? They say the images shape your reality. What you see reflects what you feel reflects what you think dictates how you act, and how you act will dictate how people will react to you. That reaction is called your status in society. And that status is dictated by how it is inflected upon the people of which you are responsive to. When I see black boys get into conflicts, the first thing they may say is, "You black nigga, you big nappy head, big nose." Huh, sounds comical, doesn't it? But look and examine what he's saying. He's cursing every feature and characteristic that's an age to be his own characteristic, because he's uncomfortable with who he is, because he doesn't know who he is. I've often said, regardless of what people do to you, you are still responsible for what you do for you. When someone's trying to sell you something, you've got to ask 4 fundamental questions. Question number 1, who's selling it? Question number 2, what are they selling? Question number 3, who are they selling it to? And question number 4, who in the hell stands to gain the most from the sale? But when you as a people have been sold, fuck the questions and find the answers. Peace out.
I want to offer my sincere apologies. The language on that one was most inappropriate, and I haven't listened to. Well, I certainly haven't listened to this track. I haven't listened to this album for some time now, and I do truly and sincerely apologise for some of the vulgarities expressed there. I'm certainly not in favour of condescending language being shared between us at all, and definitely not an advocate of sharing it over the airwaves. So what I'll do now is just go through, in the book, there's a section 4.4 which is connections between Malcolm X and Kwame Nkrumah. And I'll go through as much of this as I can. I'm sure our brother Astamari is not far away and will want to come and make a start on his program. So let me just go through this quickly. 4.41 Nkrumah and Malcolm X, friends and political comrades. There was a close connection between Kwame Nkrumah and Malcolm X, one which is not necessarily highlighted, since their joint history appears not to have been systematically reviewed and documented. The two were clearly friends as well as political comrades. However, more importantly, an examination of their strategic approaches reveals that they were developing a joint plan for African liberation, with Nkrumah coordinating the overall strategy and Malcolm X coordinating the diasporan, the African diasporan contribution to it. One of the obvious points of unity between Kwame Nkrumah and Malcolm X was their joint affiliation to the UNIA. They both regularly attended UNIA meetings. Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta are reported to have been members of the UNIA. Nkrumah, according to Umar Johnson, was a member of the Philadelphia chapter of the UNIA, and certainly both of Malcolm X's parents were senior members of the UNIA. Malcolm X's parents were dedicated senior organizers in the UNIA. His father regularly took Malcolm to secret UNIA meetings. Both of their ideas were influenced, even shaped by their UNIA experiences. Even the enemy understood the significance of that connection. During their spying activities, US agents, CIA, and State Department observed that Malcolm X and Kwame Nkrumah met on Marcus Garvey's birthday, the 17th of August, 1958. There's a connection between the three of them. So Malcolm X and Kwame Nkrumah had a secret meeting, basically, on Marcus Garvey's birthday in 1958, showing not only that Malcolm X and Nkrumah were strongly connected, but that they realized that they were part of the legacy of Marcus Garvey. Their political closeness is further demonstrated by the fact that Nkrumah became a frequent columnist in Muhammad Speaks, the newspaper set up by Malcolm X for the Nation of Islam. So, it's not something that's generally known that, Nkrumah used to write for Muhammad Speaks. But that happened because of Malcolm X and because of his friendship with Malcolm X. The bond between the two was maintained even after Nkrumah had returned to Africa. For instance, on the 5th of October 1960, Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah and Malcolm X, President Nkrumah and Malcolm X, addressed the same rally in Harlem. They addressed an audience of 1,000 people outside the Teresa Hotel. This was the same hotel that would later be the venue for the launch of the Organization of Afro-American Unity on the 28th of June, 1964. Following the assassination, Nkrumah sent a wreath to Malcolm X's funeral saying, "The death of Malcolm X shall not have been in vain." Yet another example of the enemy's acknowledgement of their political camaraderie came in the form of a plot to assassinate Kwame Nkrumah on the 21st of February 1966, the first anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X. Thankfully, it was abandoned before the day. So they were going to assassinate, they had already assassinated Malcolm X on the 21st of February 1965. And because, through the CIA they knew of the close networking relationship between Kwame Nkrumah and Malcolm X, they had planned to assassinate Kwame Nkrumah exactly 1 year later on the 21st of February 1966. But the executioner, or the assassinator, got cold feet. For this we have to be thankful. The third consolidation of their political camaraderie, extending beyond the grave, is demonstrated by the fact that in October 1967, Nkrumah received the first ever Black Power Award in memory of Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Patrice Lumumba, and Harriet Tubman. It is also important to note that Nkrumah's essay, The Spectre of Black Power, outlining the diaspora element of the African liberation strategy, was dedicated to Malcolm X and other revolutionaries. Notice he says Malcolm X and other revolutionaries, because Malcolm X was the one spearheading the diasporan element of the strategy. 4.42, evidence of Nkrumah's respect for Malcolm X. President Kwame Nkrumah granted Malcolm X, a man not officially representing any country, a personal audience in his presidential office. During the discussion, they agreed that Pan-Africanism was the key to unity between African people at home and the diaspora. Furthermore, Malcolm X was given the honour of addressing the Ghanaian parliament. Understand this, he's not a statesman officially, but Malcolm X is getting all of the trappings of being a statesman when he comes to Ghana. He has a personal meeting with the president, an actual personal meeting with the president, one-to-one, no one else there, just the two of them, and then he is allowed to address the parliament. Notice that when Obama went there the other day, that those were the things that they allowed Obama to do. This is what the Osagyefo for Kwame Nkrumah allowed Malcolm X to do, even though technically he wasn't a statesman. He was being treated as a statesman because he was the leader of the diasporan African people through the OAAU, and he was carrying forward that part of the overall strategy of African liberation. Reading on. Several African leaders, including Kwame Nkrumah, issued invitations for Malcolm X to attend the second OAU conference as an official observer. He was more than an official observer. Yes, he was an official observer, but he also spoke at that conference. And this is the conference where the other leaders overrode the objections of Emperor Haile Selassie, who was trying to prevent Malcolm X speaking. He was operating on behalf of US Satan, by the way, who was supplying millions and millions and millions of pounds into the coffers of Ethiopia. Nkrumah supported Malcolm X's UN petition, as well as offering him a government job. It is clear that Nkrumah and Alex Kwezon-Saki, the Ghanaian ambassador to the United Nations, developed a close personal as well as political friendship with Malcolm X. This relationship terrified US Satan's secret services. They feared US Satan's anti-African racism would be exposed at the UN. So they were working hard, and Selassie was helping them in this, to prevent Malcolm having a voice in the United Nations arena. Fearing for Malcolm's life, Nkrumah offered Malcolm X a job as a speechwriter and policy advisor on East-West relations. They were both aware that Malcolm's life was potentially in peril. Nonetheless, Malcolm X politely declined. He bravely put his people's welfare before his own personal safety. So you got to understand that at this time it was becoming clearer and clearer that there may be plots to assassinate Malcolm X. And so, Kwame Nkrumah said to him, look, don't worry, just come here, you work here, you'll be safe, we've got a job for you, etc., etc. But Malcolm X, knowing that there were these tensions that could lead to him being assassinated, said, no, I've got to go back and do my job. He was willing to put his life on the line, and actually did put his life on the line in order to contribute most effectively to African liberation. He could have been alive much longer had he taken that offer, but for reasons of integrity, reasons of principle, he did not. The offer was not a one-off gesture. It was indicative of Nkrumah's respect for African people in the diaspora and his willingness to engage them as full partners in the liberation struggle. Other diasporan Africans employed to work within Ghanaian government structures included George Padmore, who was from Guyana, Arthur Lewis, who was from St. Lucia, Sam Davis, US Satan, Ras McConan, who was from Guyana. Other diasporan Africans known to have worked in the Ghanaian government under Nkrumah included Shirley Dubois, US Satan, Alphonse and Dorothy Hunton, US Satan also, and William Dubois, W.E. Dubois, very often he's called, also based in US Satan. Kwame Ture, also known as Stokely Carmichael, also worked in Ghana with a level of access to Nkrumah. So Kwame Ture, who was born in Trinidad and lived his adult life, much of it in US Satan, also worked there. In separate conversations with the author, Julia Wright, daughter of Richard Wright, the academic, and Stuart Hall, both confirmed that they worked in Ghana under Nkrumah. So I spoke to these people myself. And Julia Wright, who lives in Paris, she was telling me stories about her experiences working in Ghana, and how, you know, she was always terrified when Nkrumah would come and talk to her. You know, you got the leader of the African world talking to you, and she'd be trembling more or less. He wasn't talking in any hostile way, but it was just the aura of the man. She explained, she explained to me, and Stuart Hall, he worked in the diaspora, worked in Ghana also, and he said he was telling me about work that he was doing around music there. Reading on, Malcolm X addressed the biggest audience of his tour whilst in Ghana. He spoke to 200 students at Winneba. Winneba is the ideological institute that Nkrumah built in Ghana. His visit was an important catalyst for diasporan African people who had returned home. A Malcolm X committee was set up in Ghana as a result. And I'm just going to read through the final section now. The final section, 4.43. It reads as follows. So the heading is Evidence of Malcolm X Respect for Kwame Nkrumah, and it reads as follows. Malcolm X described Ghana as the fountainhead of Pan-Africanism. In doing so, he was acknowledging Nkrumah as the leader of the Pan-African movement, which meant he was himself a part. Malcolm X also told us that when he met with Nkrumah, the other other African leaders, and I quote Malcolm X, it's the only time that I've quoted Malcolm X. He's a brilliant orator, and I didn't quote him on purpose because it might take our attention away from his from his strategic ideas. This quote says, when he met with African leaders, he said, "It broadened my scope so much, I could see with greater clarity." That's what Malcolm X tells us. Yeah. In the midst of meetings with leaders of the African world, Malcolm X told us that his highest honor in Africa was an audience with President Kwame Nkrumah. It is also clear that Malcolm X agreed with Nkrumah that Pan-Africanism was the framework for developing working unity between African people at home and African people in the diaspora, as well as being the key to solving all of our problems. On the basis of their common understanding, Malcolm X set up the Organization of Afro-American Unity whilst in Ghana. So he set up that organization whilst it was in Ghana, and he set it up as the diasporan twin to the Organization of African Unity. All of this came out of the meeting with Nkrumah. The Organization of Afro-American Unity adopted Nkrumah's philosophy of seek ye first the political kingdom. This was a direct result of his meeting with Nkrumah. In practical terms, this involved political education and voter registration drives. Malcolm X also supported Nkrumah's idea of a strong, independent continental government. He saw the African Union government as a critical milestone in the solution to the problems confronting African people in the diaspora. Malcolm X even observed that Kwame Nkrumah, who by then was firmly entrenched as leader of the liberation movement, was completely up to date on what was happening in Harlem. This is a further indication of Nkrumah's keen interest in diasporan African matters. It is also evidence that he saw the diaspora and the motherland as part of a unified whole and planned strategically on that basis. It was therefore no accident that Malcolm X's organization, the Organization of African American Unity, initiated in Ghana and operating at the same time as Nkrumah, was at the heart of attempting to develop a progressive Organization of African Unity. Malcolm X's strategic approach, reveals that it was designed to fit in with and complement the OAU model that Nkrumah was working on at the time. Malcolm X's strategy was the diasporan part of Nkrumah's strategy prior to the decreased emphasis on armed struggle. Malcolm's untimely assassination on the 21st of February 1965 explains why there was no update, keeping it in concert with Nkrumah's post-1966 strategic change of emphasis. And that brings the strategy of Malcolm X to a close. What I will do is I'll just let me share one more Arman Rashidi rhythm. I'll be listening very keenly to the language in this one, but I will. I don't know him as a person that uses untoward language, so I will chant another.
Young brother, let me talk to you for a minute. You've proven how much of a gangster, a pimp player, hustler that you can be. But what about the man that I don't see? You see, a gangster, a pimp player, and a hustler are only terms that describe a temporary stage of boyhood. But what our community needs right now is manhood. Black man, you've proven that you can master every arena that you fought your way into. But now let's master the arena of community and family responsibility. It's a God-ordained responsibility of manhood, and you will never be respected as a man until you do so.
You gotta be a man.
Douglas once said that a man without force is without the essential dignity to build. He said that human nature is so constituted that it cannot honor a helpless man. Although it may pity him, even this it won't do long, unless the signs of power arise. Where there's no struggle, there's no progress. Power conceives nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Men may not get all that they pay for in this world, but they will certainly pay for all that they get. This simply means that powerful people don't teach powerless people how to take their power away, and black faces in high places don't necessarily guarantee a better day. You see, it's no longer survival of the fittest, but survival of the slickest. Whacked out pimp players and hustlers vying for who can become the richest. I'm not telling you that you shouldn't make your ends meet, but be careful of the people that you walk on and the people that you mistreat. You see, you can't fight and beg at the same time and then still be expected to be respected as a man in your right mind.
Man to man.
warriors. Some say the best in the land. But you boast about some things, player, that you just don't understand. You see, making a baby, that don't make you a man. Before you plant your seed, player, make sure that you got a plan. A plan for yourself, the mama and the baby as well. Or you may all find yourselves in your own man-made hell. You see, you have a lot of power that's hanging between your legs. Use it to produce a nation that builds and not a nation that begs. You see, your manhood will never be determined by how many women you get in bed or how many brothers you kill and pump full of lead. Take care of your woman and your children at home. She'll never have any need to have to call Tyrone. You see, brothers, you can't hang out every night at the club and then come home and expect respect from the woman that you say you love. You know what old folks say, ain't nothing open after two but another woman's legs, or a scandalous brother with a tendency to want to beg. It's time you build your body and strengthen your mind, instead of talking all that shit and getting left behind. Develop a plan and stop just speaking for the thrill. Empower each other and teach these young brothers how to live. I'm saying these things because it's important to me. I want to see you beautiful black brothers be the best that you possibly can be. Love the Creator, yourself, your family, and the entire nation. But most of all, if it happens, learn to love your own black creation. Man to man, I'm sure you understand. Peace out.
Yes, that was a little interlude there from Armin Rashidi. Better quality than the one previously. So I'm glad that the language is of a more appropriate standard in that track. And the message, of course, was a good one. So we've come to the end of the chapter on Malcolm X. We're going to be moving on to chapter 5 next week. So let me just give a sense of summary of where we are so far. We have been looking at the first 4 chapters of Pan-Africanism from Program to Philosophy. Those 4 chapters are focused on strategy to help us better understand the strategy of Pan-Africanism. The first chapter was an introduction and a kind of sense to a general Pan-Africanist strategy. The subsequent chapters, that's 2, 3, and 4, we're looking at the strategies of some great Pan-Africanists. Not all, but some great Pan-Africanists. So we were looking at the strategy of Marcus Garvey. That was the first strategy that we looked at. And Marcus Garvey is the foundation upon which Pan-Africanist strategies are built. It's the grounding of Pan-Africanist strategies. The legacy of Marcus Garvey permeates, all subsequent attempts in the Pan-Africanist direction. Now we know that there were disputes between W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey in the 1920s. And when we put those disputes into context, what they were doing is they were battling to define Pan-Africanism. They were following different approaches to try and work out, they didn't realize they were doing this, but they were trying to work out what Pan-Africanist strategies worked best, for the advancement of our people. And the outcome of that was in 1945, when you had the 5th Pan-Africanist Congress, where W.E.B. Du Bois was present, but Marcus Garvey by then had crossed to meet the ancestors. The path chosen was the Garvey path. Pan-Africanism went down the Garvey route, even though Du Bois was physically there at the time. It went down the Garvey route. And so Garvey laid the foundation for strategic Pan-Africanism. And then what happens is the next person to come to the fore to have the world stature of a Garvey, and in fact even greater world stature than a Garvey, because he was actually in office as the president of Ghana, is the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. And this is why the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah was chosen. This was the reason for choosing the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. So Marcus Garvey lays the foundation. He's very much the leader of the African world in the 1920s. And then by the time you get to the 1960s, Kwame Nkrumah is the leader of the African world. But whereas Garvey was in the diaspora and never actually had the opportunity to set foot on African soil, for Nkrumah, he was born on African soil and was able to take the strategy of Garvey, if you like, to the next level, to start building government on the soil of Africa and to start the industrialization process on the soil of Africa. These things Garvey was not able to do because he was blocked by the hidden hand of imperialism. And Nkrumah takes it forward. But then he brings in his longtime friend, Malcolm X. And they agree that Malcolm X, secretly this is, they agree that Malcolm X will take care of the diasporan segment of the overall liberation strategy. So what you had was Kwame Nkrumah as the world leader of African people, and Malcolm X as the diasporan leader of African people, and Malcolm X linking into the central strategy of the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. So this is what you had. Now, the CIA caught onto this. The intelligence agencies worked out what was happening. It's their job to spy on us and to work out what we're doing. They worked out what was happening. And it's arguable that understanding the scope of the role and the importance of Malcolm X in the world, it's arguable that that's why he was assassinated. It's certainly arguable. Now, the leader of the diasporan world up until 1959 was George Padmore. George Padmore, who died in 1959. There are those who believe that he was actually killed rather than died. He came over here for medical treatment and died whilst he was here in Britain. Some people genuinely believe that he was killed, but that's not proven. So we can say that he died. We cannot confirm that he was killed, but we can raise the suspicion that he was killed. He was the leader of the diasporan element. And when he died, I mean, it had a profound impact. A profound impact on the forward-moving plan of the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. And Malcolm X comes along some years later, and he is brought in, and Nkrumah wanted him to actually come and live in Ghana, and to do his role from within Ghana, but he didn't accept that offer, and Kwame Nkrumah understood why he didn't accept that offer, and he went back and sadly was assassinated. But the three strategies that we've looked at come together in that way, that Marcus Garvey is the foundation, and in the next generation, the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah takes up the leadership role, and Malcolm X takes up the leadership role of the diasporan element of the African liberation strategy. So we've been looking at strategies, and the first half of the book, almost half of the book actually, is about strategy. The remainder of the book is about theory. The theory of Pan-Africanism is what we're going to be discussing from here on in. So next week's chapter is entitled International Class Analysis and African Leadership in the Global Revolution. So we'll be looking at that section, and we'll be looking at our position in relation to the capitalist system and how insidious the capitalist system is in its oppression of African people, how it hits us from all angles. We'll be analysing that. We'll be looking at that properly. We'll be seeing that were it not for African people, there would be no capitalist system. That's how integral and important we are to it. The chapter after that looks at what I've called the greater cycle of revolution, so that we understand the issues involved in the transformation from one type of society to another. Revolution in the social setting is about the transition of one type of society to another. The chapter after that is entitled Scientific Socialism, Africa's Solution, and explains the theory of scientific socialism. This is important, because most of us don't even know what it is. Some of us even have opinions about it without knowing what it is. And so we're going to spend time examining scientific socialism, so that we are all in a position to be able to understand what it is and make up our minds about it. This is important. And so you see the three chapters that I've just mentioned, the International Class Analysis chapter, which is an examination of capitalism, the Revolution section, which is the chapter 6, and then chapter 7, which is the scientific socialism. Revolution is the process, it's in the middle of the two. Revolution is the process of moving from one type of society to another. In the social, political and economic setting, it is the movement from capitalism to socialism. And so that will be explained in the coming weeks. And then we're going to move on to the higher level. Because when we're looking at capitalism, when we're looking at revolution, when we're looking at scientific socialism, fundamentally we're looking at the economic and political aspects of social theory. And in this case of Pan-Africanist theory. What we're going to do is we are going to move on to looking at even higher levels. So the next chapter will look at the ideology of Pan-Africanism. So we've started off looking at the strategies. From strategies, we've moved on to, or we will be moving on to looking at the economics. When we get to the economics, when we completed the economics, looked at the capitalism, revolution, and scientific socialism, the economics and politics, I should say, we will then move on to ideology, understanding the principles of Pan-Africanism. And then after ideology, there's only one level left. And that level is the philosophical, the highest level of theory. And so we will then look at the philosophical level of Pan-Africanism. So this is the direction in which we're going to be moving over the coming week. So we've actually laid a foundation. Literally, we've laid a foundation for coming for the coming sessions. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to let me drop one more tune before I go.
No, just sit down. There's just some things that I guess I just need to get off my chest. You know, I see how hard you work and so many of the difficult things that you tend to go through. I'm not blind to the pain that I see in your eyes. But I can only say that this far, I feel as if I failed my greatest test. And you know that test, of course, is of pleasing you, protecting you, loving you, and placing you high above every woman on this earth.
Your heavenly body is so precious. You're lying beside me in the morning. Our love interaction is so special. Overflowing and so warm, ebony queen, so good to me. Baby, you're so good to me. Give me your love, and I'll have everything, ebony queen. I'll be your king. I'll be baby. When we're in love, just be love. We can have everything, baby.
You see, you are me, and I am you. And together we reproduce ourselves. Black woman, please forgive me for taking so very long and recognizing your stance. For I've been lost in a sea of decadence, blind to the ignorant craving of a mentally dead and corrupt world. I now see the divine light of truth. Yeah, the Creator has shown me the path. Come walk with me and help me regain our king and queen status. And together we'll rule the world. the spiritual force that motivates me to live. For your love, my life, I'd be willing to give. Mother of the world, life giver to every man, boy and girl. You're just a vessel of love and sensuality, the most pleasing gift to mankind's reality. Yeah, baby, your body, soft, a sexual fantasy that speaks out loud. You're revelating, breathtaking, stimulating, captivating, illuminating, a magnificent journey of ecstasy that sets my mind, my body, and my soul.
So good to me.
There's nothing in this world that's what I wouldn't do for you. And I want you to understand that the passion I feel for you is unlike any other in this world. Sometimes words can't express the way I truly feel. But I want you to know, sweetheart, this love I have is real.
Everything. Your love is motivating, captivating, stimulating. That's why I love you.
Yes, that's Arman Rashidi. And it only remains now for me to say my goodbyes. And really just to wish everybody a good evening. So let's just try this. And we should hear something coming through shortly. So it just remains for me to say a big thank you. Thank you to all of the people that have taken time to listen to the program this evening. I want to also say a big thank you to all the people that aspire to listen. I've seen a few messages coming through, people asking for links. So a big thank you to those people that aspire to listen. I want to say a big thank you to my fellow presenters here on Blessed Radio. I'm thinking in particular of my brother Astamari, who will be with you fairly shortly. I want to say a big thank you to the engineers who are in the background and who have done a lot of work over the past 2 weeks to improve the quality of the sound being generated. We say a big thank you to them. I also want to say a big thank you to the station's management for the work that they are doing. Very important work that the station's management is doing in just making this infrastructure available to us as a people. But most of all, I want to say a big thank you. A major thank you to our ancestors, without whom none of us would be here today. With that, I wish you a good evening, and I encourage you all to listen same time next week between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. on Monday evenings. Love and respect to you all. Asheo.
Is inkomo zobaba bafana zipina izinkomo zobaba bafana zipina izinkomo zobaba webafana thathani izinduku webafana thathani izinduku webafana thathani izinduku siyobheka izinkomo zobaba esigangeni webafana thathani izinduku webafana thathani izinduku webafana thathani izinduku siyobheka izinkomo zobaba esigangeni Osiyolobola ngani na masiyeni inkomo zobaba semuka nomoya 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 Ilanga lishonile bafana masibuye izinkomo zobaba 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 Webafana thathani izinduku Webafana thathani izinduku Webafana thathani izinduku siyobheka izinkomo zobaba esigangeni Webafana thathani izinduku Webafana thathani izinduku Webafana thathani izinduku siyobheka izinkomo zobaba esigangeni Semuka nomoya Osiyolobola ngani na masiyeki inkomo zobaba semuka